Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's the most disturbing thing you have ever witnessed? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Crane broke with my farmer uncle in it. He cartwheeled through 40 feet of air and landed on his ass. Broken hip, broken back, broken arm, brain bleed, blood pouring out of his face, unresponsive, gasping for air. I was positive that I was watching him die while trying to make the call to 911. Guy threaded the needle with where and how he landed. Made a 95% recovery at 75 years old. Just has a slight limp. Probably a 6-year-old kid who I helped treat in the ER. He had been beaten to death by his father with a belt that had a big metal buckle on one end. I work in the emergency room. An ambulance comes in with a 2-year-old choking. CPR in progress. Everybody gets to work. I take over CPR. Child is blue, cold, pulseless. Every time we pause to check, we continue for probably 20 minutes. The longest 20 minutes of my life. Before the doctor officially pronounced the time of death, the parents wanted to come in and say goodbye. As I take over and begin my 4th rotation, being the one giving chest compressions, the parents come in, standing directly next to me, and talk to the child. I will never forget the mom singing, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine," while I feel the crunched sternum grinding under my palm. That was 7 years ago, and it still crosses my mind almost every day. When I was 15, I took acid for the first time. My friend stayed straight to keep watch. We went for a drive, and he didn't notice his dog under the truck, and he ran over its head. It was crushed, but alive, and I had to ride in the back of the pickup, holding the dog still in my lap while we drove to a vet to put it down. Tripping and holding a crushed dog head while it screamed, and there was nothing I did or could do but sit there and do the job. Once it was over, I couldn't stop screaming for half an hour. Then I rode my bike home and stayed in my room for 4 to 5 days. Not my first-hand story, but it still haunts me. 2 little girls aged 3 and 5 would go to the community wading pool that was manned by city-employed instructors that were students getting education degrees. My sibling was an instructor for a few summers while getting her degree. These 2 sisters would go daily, all day, every day. They wore too small clothing and outgrown shoes. One day, my sibling saw them huddled by a tree near the pool, and when she approached, she saw they were eating a ball. They were so hungry that they were eating a large foam ball. I still can't get the image she described out of my head. My sibling contacted appropriate people, and the siblings and their mother received help, but the mother OD'd a while later. I believe the sisters were actually adopted by the older one's kindergarten teacher a couple of years later, and they are thriving little girls that are very happy and cared for. I live in the city and witnessed a traffic accident literally right in front of my nose while waiting at the crossover. A motorcycle that was speeding way too fast, not wearing proper gear, just jeans and a t-shirt. He already came in hot when the light just went green. So all the other cars were just starting to accelerate when he passed them illegally at pretty high speed. Just as their light went on green, a jogger tried to quickly cross the street. The motorcycle braked hard but still hit the jogger, who literally flew like 15 feet further. The motorcyclist somehow still managed to drive away on his crashed bike. I will never forget the jogger screaming. Watching a person burn alive in their vehicle because they selflessly saved the many instead of the one. A trucker whose brakes went out because they caught on fire. Cars were catching on fire as he passed them down one of the steepest grades in the state. He ran his truck into the ditch between the roadways. His wife got out. He was stuck and screaming. To this day, I remember the screams. I was 10. I'm 5 times that now. That poor dude. When I was using, someone brought me to a house to score of absolute squalor, like out of a movie. It was completely dilapidated. The rug was horrifying to look at, and everything was covered in dog shit. I don't even think it had been cleaned in years. The woman was an indescribable waste of a human being. But the most heartbreaking thing were the kids that were homeschooled. They were filthy, running around barefoot on that rug in clothes that didn't fit, and they were so excited to see me. They were desperate for human interaction. It was clear her interaction with them stopped at screaming profanities at them. The dog had what I'm sure was a constant stream of puppies that she sold at a premium. She had the means to care for them. It was the most upsetting and heartbreaking experience I've had because those kids did not ask to be brought into this. Watched a car explode in flames. A drunk driver rear-ended a car on a shoulder of the highway beneath an overpass. Pulled over, guys screaming, "No, no, no," while another dude films. The rear of the car is engulfed. I and another guy try to open it to grab this older woman, but the fire is too hot. The weather seal on the door sears the skin off my fingers. FD and PD finally show up along with EMS. Finally we hear shouting above us. Some bystanders on the overpass shouting, "Over there! There are two more over there!" We look and search in the tall grass, and sure as shit, there's an older male and young girl. EMS is with me. The older guy is DOS, and the girl is agonal, with a pulse and brain matter coming out. Throw some gloves on, C-collar, and jaw thrust. Grab a backboard and get her in the truck. Start a line, start bagging, and take off. She died later. The girl ran out of gas and called her parents. They were filling up her car with a gas can when the drunk driver hit, killing all three. One burning alive, I'd suspect. Mother, father, and daughter, with their son at home, now an orphan. My ex stabbing me and then choking me out, asking me why he shouldn't kill me. I wonder what brings a person to that type of evil. I'll never forget the darkness I felt coming out of that boy and how evil he looked. It was insane and intense. I never felt true fear in my life until I lay on that floor in a literal pool of my blood after he left, and it was just red and confusion. That's a painful lesson to learn, but if it lent some perspective to what you were going through, then perhaps it was meant to happen. Hope you're doing better. Tissue necrosis in my mom's fingers and feet when she was in septic shock in the ICU, and then watching her take her last breath, unable to hold her hand because her fingers were squishy and black. The other was when I worked at a vet's. An incontinent and immobile dog was left outside in the summer for days. Owners finally brought him to us when he wouldn't eat. We quickly realized he had been urinating and defecating where he lay without moving for days. We suggested euthanasia as the dog was older, couldn't walk, was blind, couldn't eat, and was suffering. Owner refused, so we went to work cleaning him up before starting IV fluids. This poor dog was covered in maggots. We were shaving the back half of the body, and there were holes and tunnels that maggots were falling out of and spilling out onto the floor. It took 3 hours and 4 people to clean him up. His back end was more holes than intact skin. The next morning, the owners decided to put him to sleep. They neglected him and left him in a state to become maggot infested, and then let him suffer longer while we cleaned him. A British father on holiday with his family in Koh Samui, wife and 2 kids. He and his wife were on their own moped with a kid each. Dad went normally through a roundabout, but the bike slipped on the exit and he slid right under a huge truck tire, and his head was crushed. He wasn't wearing a helmet, but the child was. There was so much blood. I'll never forget the wife's wailing and the kids in shock. When I was 17 years old, I found the body of a man who had hung himself in the woods. I was hiking with my brother and our friend. After a moment of shock, I ran over to see if he might still be alive. His skin was discolored and his eyes were bulging out of his head. This was during a time in my life when I was struggling with depression myself and was considering taking my own life at one point. Finding him there was immensely sad and really helped me put everything into perspective. It was a permanent solution to a temporary problem. While there was nothing gory about this, I was in the same hotel room as my dad when I was 23, when he passed away from natural causes. He woke me up in the middle of the night making strange noises, which I found out later were agonal breathing. I turned on the light and immediately noticed his color was blue. I immediately called 911 and did CPR on him until the paramedics arrived. We were in a hotel 5 hours away from home because of a job he had to do. He also rented an F-250 because our car at the time was unreliable. I also took Ambien to help me sleep. When I asked the paramedics if they could drive me with them to the hospital, because 1, I'm in an unfamiliar area, 2, I've never driven anything bigger than a car, 3, I had taken my Ambien, 4, my father was obviously dying. Despite all that, they told me no. Basically yelled no to my face. I had to drive a giant F-250 I was unfamiliar with just to be with my dad in his last moments. I come from a bad hood. A close friend was a professional car thief when I was younger. I'd been shot at more than once, and then to top it all off, I worked EMS and disaster relief when I was younger. To say I have a thick skin to things would be an understatement. My list is damn long, but I will share the 2 worst I've seen. One was from EMS days, getting a call about a 380-pound guy dead in his chair. Had to call the fire department for aid to cut the chair out from the fluids that leaked from his and hardened into the chair. He was already dead for a couple of days. Luckily, the rest of the FD and corns headache, but the fluids and small and decaying flesh caused no one checked on him, and he didn't take care of himself. Plus, days of old food all over and a filthy house with food and soda all over will haunt me till the day I die. The second, doing disaster relief after Katrina, was gutting housing down to the frames to be restored later with habitat. I won't even get into bodies and pets we found in the process. But the worst, absolutely worst, was my team was moving out of an old fridge. Now, our MO was to wrap it and strap it before moving it as is. Well, some idiot did strap it, and while moving it, the lid opened, and the smell was so bad the team dropped it and it spilled. A year-old fridge that sat filled with dirty, still water, with decaying food and meat. The smell was so bad it made the whole team puke. Work had to stop at all the houses for half a block. It was that putrid. They had to have the hazmat guy come just to make sure it wasn't toxic, and the mold inside turned out it was. So the whole team had a hazmat scrubbed out, but it wasn't airborne, so after the fridge was carted off, work resumed. But the same smell lingered for like 2 days. Not to the level it was, but the hint and reminder of it was there. Physical injury no longer even fazed me. I've seen too many bullet holes and critical car injuries. It's the gross stuff that is really disturbing to me now. I was walking home from work one afternoon, and a few houses down from mine, I saw my mother-in-law standing in the street acting weird. It was a cul-de-sac. Her very close friend lived down past us, and she was in the street in front of her driveway. When I got closer, she saw me and mentioned me to go to her. So I approach her, and she is babbling and crying, and then she points to her friend's car. I look in the window, and her friend is in the passenger side with all the windows up, everything closed, and it's dead of summer. The car is directly in the sun. I open the door, and her friend is dead. I had to pull her out, which was hard to do because she was already stiff and dead weight. I pulled her out onto the driveway and gave her CPR. That's another very hard thing to do since in my head she's a dead body, but I had to do it. I couldn't just not, you know? So I did CPR until the paramedics showed up. It was already too late though. Her skin wasn't even wet from sweating. She was dry and hot, stiff, and before that, I've never seen someone dead in person. It was very sad. But touching her was all I can describe as would be uncomfortable. I shook the entire time, but I couldn't just stand there and do nothing without trying to help her. She must have been in there for most of the day because nobody had seen her since early that morning. I saw an older gentleman that was hit by a car on the highway. I didn't see the moment of impact, but I saw him lying on the ground while first responders were being called. It was really weird. I felt my brain rewriting what I was seeing as I saw it, if that makes sense. Like, I remember seeing his body on the ground and then immediately thinking, his body doesn't look right. But then less than a minute later, I couldn't even remember what his body looked like. I could only remember the top of his head. I know it's not uncommon for the brain to try to protect you from traumatic events, but I didn't realize it could happen that quickly. If it wasn't for the incident being on the news that night, I would almost believe I imagined the entire thing. On a very personal level, my grandmother was a sadistic human. I was her favorite target for quenching her abusive urges. When I was 8, my brother bought me an Easter chick with his own money. I loved that fluffy yellow baby chick. We lived on a farm, and I'd never had a pet rooster. Poultry on our farm was raised and sourced for food. Eggs were collected from laying hens. Later, the non-layers and roosters were dispatched for human nourishment. Chippy was not part of the poultry lot. He enjoyed life as my pet rooster. I helped him to dig worms. I taught him to sit in my swing while I gave him gentle pushes. He and I were constant companions. He soon grew into a beautiful bird with white feathers and a bright red comb and wattle. I simply had to call his name, and he left his perch in his personal coop to join me on a walk around the barnyard. My cousin, Rhonda, and I walk around and were playing with Chippy and feeding him grains of corn. Grandma called out for me to bring Chippy to where she stood by an old oak stump. I was leery. Rhonda was too trusting. Before I could react, the crazy old woman presented a hatchet, snatched Chippy from my arms, and proceeded to chop off his head. He flopped around. Rhonda tried to catch him, not realizing the scope of what had just happened. She was covered with spatters of blood. Chippy's head was covered and rested near the stump. I walked over and touched it. Rhonda was screaming. I had no tears. Chippy was brutally prepared for what was to come. He was disemboweled, picked and plucked of his feathers, and dismembered, his remains fed to the hogs. Chippy was then cooked up and served. I know I had to eat what I was given. It made me physically ill. I knew better than to throw up, because that would have been collected and served to me as well. Some people don't know exactly why they're mentally ill. Others are not so lucky. I have in-laws who work at the American defense industry, and they're most morally bankrupt, deeply incurious morons I've ever met. They have security clearance. They bend over backwards to be bad people. They think anyone who isn't rich is poor because of moral failings. I was riding in their car with my wife, them, and their 2 kids. We were talking about what their jobs entailed, meaning as what is making weapons to kill bad guys, usually in the Middle East. I asked why killing one of the bad guys was worth bombing an entire wedding, school bus, hospital, etc. Because you need to get the bad guys before they can get you. I asked what constituted a bad guy, and they said they make weapons. I asked why the car we were driving in were weapons. With me, my wife, her sister's husband, and their kids was any less of a valid target than one of those school buses. No answer. It was a really quiet, and they just stopped the conversation.